I am honored to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Ian Mell. Dr. Mell works at Manchester University in the UK and is a leading expert on green infrastructure planning. He has over 15 years of experience in researching, developing, and evaluating green infrastructure in academia and practice. So, Ian, the floor is yours. Please welcome.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And now I'm very embarrassed as usual. I hate these things. I talk about trees and grass. That's all I do. But I think trees and grass are really important, as we'll hear from the other speakers. I think it's also really nice that from hearing from the Minister and Virginia's conversation, talking about livability, talking about inspiring this change and thinking about what the future might look like. And so rather than doing that, I'm going to talk about the past. But I think thinking about the past and thinking about where we've come from with those ideas is really important, because we've all made mistakes, we've all had successes, and if we don't learn from those, then well, what are we actually doing? So I'm going to talk about green infrastructure in the UK, and particularly in England, where we've done some things really well, and just to put this out there, the UK is currently on fire. It's an awful place to live. Don't go there. We've got a terrible government. It's not good. And because of that, that's really irrelevant, because the way in which they're controlling and managing the country is relevant to green infrastructure, particularly in terms of around how we fund it and how we manage things. And as I've already been said, I've worked in this area since 2005, and GI really started getting going in the UK in about 2004. So it seemed to be I was there at the start, and I think I've been quite lucky to be able to think about it for this 17-year period. And things that we always come back to, and things that we've been discussing yesterday in the pub, for example, about what is green infrastructure? What do we mean by it? What do we think of? What do we visualize when we see it? Do we think about trees? Do we think about big parks? Do we think about classic Chinese landscape architecture? Or do we think about these places which could be anywhere? And because of this, we're talking about language, we're talking about terminology, we're talking about GI, or nature-based solutions, or urban structure, or green space planning. They all mean very similar things, but they're also very, very almost intimate, that we all have our favorites. So I was recently in Copenhagen, and they really like nature-based solutions. And I don't. I like green infrastructure. This is what I've spent my life doing. But these questions about who's it for, what are we doing, I think are pretty fundamental to all the conversations that we're going to have today. And I think additionally, these ideas about people and place and space and nature, even the name of the conference, Nature, Human, City, I think are fundamental to these conversations. And if we always come back to those, then I think it's relatively simple to go, why are we making spaces as they are, and what do we try to do with them? And in terms of the UK, in 2004, the community forest partnerships were very influential in developing green infrastructure, and primarily because they weren't the government. So the government could pay them a little bit of money to go and do some land use planning modelling and then come back. But over time, their role and their position has been elevated because they're the authority. They're the lead advocates for trying to green our cities, and that might be the North East Community Forest, which is who I did my PhD with, the Mersey Forest, who I work with at the moment, or the South Yorkshire Community Forest Partnership, who I've worked with as well. And what we've seen with these is a transition really away from GIS mapping of what's on the ground to give a map, to considerations of risk, and where things are good and where things are bad and where we should be investing, to discussions of financing and the value that we place on nature, be it economic or social or cultural. And so in the UK, these have been really formative organisations who have really pushed government to try and do better. And it's not always been successful. There were 12 of these partnerships in 1991, there are now 8, and they've fallen because they weren't deemed to be valuable to local government, which tells you a lot about some of the thinking in the UK. But what we have kind of seen with this is this transitioning of these ideas and this evidence into action. And there's a number of different pictures here. So the picture on the bottom right is my current favourite. That's one of my colleagues, Professor James Rothwell. The most excited man you'll ever see looking at a bioswale. He was jumping up and down to it, enthuse our students about why this worked. And the things he was pointing out were quality, the right place, and the right engineered solution. And so his view was that we already know the technology, we just need to get it in the right place. And I think what's interesting when we're looking at GI in the UK is just the multitude of approaches that we can use to investing in GI. It's not just trees, it's not just parks, it's not just waterways, it's green walls, green roofs, play areas, taking the street on the bottom left from a very busy central London street and making it a park. It's not the best park. It's still quite noisy because of the road next to it, but it's a lot better than it was. And so I think a lot of the successes that we've had are where we've seen quite localized understandings of what the evidence is telling us. Let's have more and better in the right place, and then doing it. And a lot of this is wrapped up in finance, in political will, and we see a massive variation across England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, and even within particular areas of the UK. So I live in the northwest. Manchester is far more progressive than Liverpool, yet they're only 32 miles away from each other. So we shouldn't really be limited by having a single palette of landscape types to work with, but actually we need to think more innovatively. And although they all look quite similar, they are all very different when you're on site. But we have to locate this within a policy landscape, and here's where I might spend 5 minutes bad-mouthing the British government because they've not been great. But the UK, I think like most countries, has had a roller coaster ride of policy. Some good, so 2004, we had a centre-left government. They created a mandate to create sustainable communities. It was far from perfect, but it really generated some of these ideas around climate resilience, having more biodiverse landscapes in urban areas, thinking about how people interact with these places, and placing them in very urbanised contexts. And this project was relatively successful up until 2010, when the UK decided we'd like a new government, and we got a whole suite of policies where the environmental credentials of the UK kind of dropped and dropped and dropped. And particularly this document here, this is the finest piece of legislation ever. It basically says we have to plan for beauty, and only beauty, but doesn't define what beauty is. Now, there are 100+ people in the audience here. We would all think of something different. So how do you plan coherently, with continuity for the future, when the base level terminology isn't clear? And we see that with a lot of the legislation in the UK, where they pick up the latest buzzword, resilience, sustainability, beauty in this case, and run with it, but don't ever back it up with meaning and value, and actually legislation which can work. So hearing that there's legislation here in Lithuania which is far more progressive is amazing, because I teach this to my students and I tend to bang my head on the table and go, wow, it's all a bit rubbish. And then we get this. This is the Environment Act. This is the latest piece of environmental legislation in the UK, and it demands that we have to improve the level of biodiversity on all new development, what's called biodiversity net gain, by 10% minimum. This is probably the first piece of legislation in decades that has actually said, you all as individual developers and land managers have to do something positive. Now, how they manage that, how they do it, it's open to interpretation. But we do seem to occasionally get things right. And I think this is where learning from the past is really important. The minister mentioned Ebenezer Howard. It's like, great, yeah, we can go back to the 1890s and we were doing things right. We can go back to Frederick Law Olmsted in the 1860s and learn how to do sustainable drainage in spun cities. We know how to do it. We just pretend that we don't and move further forward. And I think the UK is particularly blinded by this, We like the new and the shiny and what's next, rather than considering what we've done wrong. If we've done it wrong, we'll do something different. And we never actually learn properly, which is quite frustrating, but makes for an interesting academic life, to be honest. And within that conversation, we've seen quite a significant shift. And I think this is where it becomes really interesting. In the early 2000s, we really were just doing very basic land use modelling in the UK, working out what each patch of land was, what functions it delivered, and therefore you could say that's your green infrastructure. But as we've gone on, that's not enough, because we have to think about the individual components, the elements, how they all fit together, so composition and configuration. And I think the interesting thing, particularly in the last 3 years with COVID, is the shift to a more thematic understanding of these ideas. And that's based around issues like health, climate change, biodiversity loss, and economic development. And what's been interesting to note is that nothing's changed. The types of green infrastructure are still the same. It's just the way that we talk about them and who we talk about them to has changed. So we see, particularly in the larger parts of the UK, so London, Greater Manchester, the Glasgow Clyde Valley area, that they really have engaged with some of these thematic ideas, particularly around water management and flooding, particularly around biodiversity and climate adaptation, and especially in the last 3 years around health. COVID really did hit home in terms of how much we need a functional and high quality natural environment. And for that brief moment, from 2020 to 2022, the UK government understood this. And now we're back to normal. They've gone back to economic development first, screw the environment. And so all those benefits that we got, all that time we spent outside feeling slightly better than being indoors, have now dissipated in policy. But the evidence base is there. The economic rationale for it is there. The evidence to show that if you calculate the value of parks in London, it's got a £91 billion return on investment per year for London's economy. And those are the kind of figures that politicians really like, because they look at it costs this to plant trees, and we get this many benefits. And occasionally we have to think like economists. And I think that's where there's a lot of interesting debates happening in the UK at the moment, because we're starting to see this shift in thinking and how we might articulate some of these ideas. But we can also get it wrong. And this is a project which I'm currently working on. There was a big meeting yesterday, which I happily missed because I was flying. And it's called Urban Green Up, so an EU nature-based Horizon 2020 nature-based solutions project. It's one of 3, and within our project, we work with Valladolid in Spain and Izmir in Turkey, and they're looking at how we invest in innovative solutions for urban climate problems. Now that sounds really cool and grandiose. We're going to fix the problem. We've got a solution. Sustainable transport, a park, a green wall. Not necessarily innovative. Not necessarily working as they should be. And one thing that's come out of this project is a real dilemma, really, between people who understand the disservices, so how we can make things worse from investing in certain kinds of green infrastructure, and those who think all trees are good, we should plant more trees, always more trees. And there's real tensions within this project between myself and colleagues at the university and some of the other partners about whether we're actually making a meaningful and positive difference. And we would argue, maybe not, because things are too small. They're not really having the climatic impact that you would expect. But it's a research and development project. There's lots of money attached to it. It got slightly told off yesterday by the auditors for not being innovative enough. But I think what it shows is that the will is there and people want to try and do things, but they can be hindered by politics, by legal structures, so procurement. Can we buy your services, or do we have to go to open tender? And all that really can hinder what we can do. And again, putting trees in the wrong place has been a significant part of this project, but trees are deemed to be the symbol of green infrastructure, 'cause they're going to save the day, but it's not always the case. But if we think of some of the more positive ideas, and particularly in the UK, where we've got lots of post-industrial cities, we can talk about the way in which GI can be used as a process of renewal, of regeneration, and of repurposing. And these are just 3 examples of where Manchester's existing infrastructure has been reused. So the Mayfield Depot there on the left-hand side, Castlefield Viaduct, and the West Gorton Sponge Park, all of which use existing infrastructure, the middle one, an old railway line in the centre of the city. And all are trying to really bring nature back into an urban area in a way that is different, not just the same kind of parks that we've always had before. They're trying to work with communities so to co-create and co-produce a future which is meaningful to those communities, particularly the West Gorton Sponge Park, which is part of a wider social housing development area. And then, of course, you get developers. So the Mayfield site is a big development-led, high-end luxury apartments. But the new park, which is 6 hectares inside, opens tomorrow. And apparently it's going to be fully publicly accessible. Now, whether that is the case or whether it's permissive access with some security is different. But what all these show to me is that we can think creatively, and we have the spaces. We just have to think what's the most appropriate thing in that location. So the Castlefield Viaduct is a great example. It's about half a mile long, and it doesn't go anywhere, it just stops. And the owners want to make it into a greenway, and they appreciate that they haven't found the end point yet, literally for the project or where it comes down from the railway lines. But they know that by having this site open, and having it be something different and making it a more of an attraction, that they might get the funding and the political support to do the rest of it. So it's kind of like a High Line light, but without all the big New York jazz associated with it. But this is maybe one of the areas where many cities could have more success, because most cities in Europe have some post-industrial spaces. The Parc de Citron in Paris, great example of this happening. The Landschaftspark Duisburg Nord in the Ruhr, another one in Germany. So it's not like we don't understand this, but we need to think about it carefully. And one thing that's come along with this, which is slightly out of sync, I feel, with some of these ideas about regeneration, is the UK's obsession with metrics and numbers. And we'll hear more about how these can work later on, and I'm going to be grumpy about them for a second. So what we have in the UK is an emerging green infrastructure standard, and it's got lots of pieces in it. It's very clumsy, it's very hard to define. But within that, there are certain metrics which are deemed to be quite important. One is the biodiversity net gain I've already mentioned, so 10% more biodiversity on all new sites. Another is building with nature, a qualitative form of quality assessment for new developments. Not quite LEED, not quite BREEAM, but the same sort of idea, but based on quality of the environment rather than ticking a box saying, yes, that's X square meters. And the thing here on the left-hand side, so this is probably what I'm most proud of in my entire career, and it's that top line in yellow. So this is the accessible natural green space standard. And it's basically how far should you be from a certain size of park or green space. And we did work in 2020 during COVID, so this nearly ruined my marriage because it was quite hard. And we said we need to have more closer. So that top line, which is all local government now, needs to try and invest in green space within 200 metres of your house. Before it was 500 metres. So it's talking about immediacy. Step out of your door and you see nature. And I think that's a real challenge for many cities, but it's one I think we have to try and move towards. And again, it's rigid, it's quantitative, but it allows for some flexibility. And I think that's where we need to consider these things. So not just having one way or the other, but a blend really. And so just to wrap up, I think we've got a lot right in England with GI, and we've got a lot wrong. that we've looked at retrofitting, regeneration, we've looked at the economic and the social values of parks, of green space, of nature, and that contact, that tactile nature. We've moved towards a more landscape-led approach to planning and planning policy, but we still don't have strong legislation or regulation. So I look at other parts of Europe and I'm really jealous, because at least you can tell people they have to do something, whereas we still say you should do something. And that must versus should is a very different set of ideas. But if we come back to these people and nature and quality and quantity and provision, then I think we can move towards livability and make places which are the kind of places that we would want to live, the kind of places that we would like to spend time in, not just a thing that a big developer wants. I think that's still quite a challenge, but in the UK we have 17, 18, 19, 20 years of evidence now supporting these ideas, but we still need to push the government a bit further. So I'll stop there. If anyone has any questions, I'll have to take them, so thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation. It's been a great event so far.